Here is the thing nobody tells you about falling in love with your boss. It does not feel like a mistake when it is happening. It feels like the only thing in the world that makes sense. My name is Henry Calloway, and 36 hours ago, I was a senior copywriter at Mercer and Voss Advertising, the most prestigious creative agency on the East Coast. I had a corner desk on the 22nd floor, a reputation for writing campaigns that made grown CEOs cry in boardrooms, and a secret so enormous I had been carrying it around my chest for 11 months like a second skeleton. 36 hours ago, I kissed Alexander Voss in the elevator at 7:14 in the morning. The camera caught everything, and by 9 a.m., the entire company knew. Let me take you back to where this really began, because the elevator was not the beginning. The elevator was just where we finally stopped pretending. I met Alexander Voss on my first day at Mercer and Voss, which sounds almost comical now because the Voss in the agency name is literally his last name. His father, Edmund Voss, co-founded the agency 40 years ago. Alexander stepped in as creative director 3 years ago when Edmund had a heart attack and decided that 65 was too old to spend 18-hour days arguing about kerning and color palettes. I had been warned about him before I even walked through the door. My recruiter, a cheerful woman named Dana, had said, almost apologetically, Alexander is a visionary. He is also, and I say this with all the affection in the world, terrifying. He has incredibly high standards and zero patience for mediocrity. He will push you harder than anyone you have ever worked for. But if he believes in your work, there is no better place to be. I remember nodding like I understood what she meant. I did not understand what she meant. On day one, Alexander walked into the creative briefing for the Landon Hotel's account, set a single sheet of paper on the table, and looked around the room until it went completely silent. He was 34 years old, 6'2", with dark brown hair that curled slightly at the temples and gray eyes that seemed permanently set to a frequency of controlled intensity. He wore a navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and he moved with the particular ease of someone who had never once in his life wondered whether he belonged in a room. He said, "This is your creative brief. You have 72 hours. Not safe concepts. Not concepts that remind me of anything I have seen in the past 3 years. If I recognize it, it is not good enough. You are dismissed." And walked out. The woman sitting next to me, a senior art director named Priya, leaned over and whispered, "Welcome to Mercer and Voss." He always does that on the first brief. It is a hazing ritual. Hours barely sleeping, producing 12 concepts, 11 of which I thought were genuinely strong. Alexander reviewed them in a one-on-one session he ran with every junior lead. He went through the first 10 without expression, saying only, "Next, next, next." By the 11th, I felt the slow crawl of professional humiliation working its way up my spine. Then he stopped. He was looking at concept 12, the one I had been least sure about. It was a campaign built around a single line. Come home to the version of yourself you forgot existed. I had almost cut it 3 times because it felt too personal, too honest, too naked for a hotel chain. He looked at it for a long time. He said, "This one." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Everything else in this pile is competent. This is the only one that has a soul." "Do you know why?" I said, "Because it is honest." He held my gaze for a beat longer than was professionally comfortable, and said, "Exactly. Do not ever give me competent again. Give me honest." He slid the folder back across the table and stood to leave. I sat there for a moment after he left, feeling something I had no business feeling about my creative director on day 4 of a new job. I felt seen. I think. Not with the obvious things. Glance. It starts with the terrifying intimacy of someone understanding exactly what you meant. The next 11 months were a masterclass in professional denial. Alexander was demanding in a way that was almost theatrical. He pushed every person on the creative team relentlessly, but with me, it felt different in a way I constantly told myself meant nothing. He remembered specific lines from campaigns I had written months ago and would reference them in meetings. When I made a creative call he disagreed with, he did not override me in front of the team. He would pull me aside afterward, lay out his reasoning calmly and precisely, and then say, "You make the final call. It is your concept." But that. I told myself it was mentorship, professional investment. He saw potential in my work and was cultivating it. That was all. Approximately 400 times over 11 months. And I almost believed it for about 200 of them. The cracks started showing in February, during the Hargrove financial pitch. We had been working late, just the two of us, for 3 nights in a row. It was almost midnight on the third night when Alexander leaned back in his chair, rubbed his face with both hands, and laughed. I had never heard him laugh before, guarded like that. He said, "You know what I told my father when he asked me why I chose advertising?" I said, "What?" He said, "I told him it was the only industry where you got paid to understand what people were really afraid of and then make them feel less alone." He thought I was insane. That is the most accurate description of this job I have ever heard. He looked at me, and dim, the city glittering 40 floors below us through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and he looked at me like I had just said something that mattered to him. He said, quietly, "Yeah, I thought you might," straightened his jacket, and said he would see me tomorrow. I sat alone in that conference room for a solid 5 minutes afterward, staring at the city lights, telling myself, very firmly, absolutely not. March arrived, and with it, the Pinnacle Awards season, which at Mercer and Voss was treated with the reverence of a religious event. The Pinnacle was the industry's most prestigious creative honor. Mercer and Voss had won the Grand Prix 3 years running, and every person in the agency understood that year 4 was not optional. The pressure was enormous and shapeless, the kind that settled into the building's air itself, so that even the interns walked a little faster and spoke a little more quietly. Alexander was relentless in a way that even exceeded his usual standard. The campaign we were pushing for the Grand Prix was mine, a national healthcare initiative called See Yourself. It was the most personal work I had ever produced, a series of interconnected narratives about the specific, private ways people ignored their own pain, the kind of campaign that made people in focus groups go very quiet before they started talking. We were 3 weeks from the submission deadline when the agency's other senior copywriter, a man named Carter Sloan, walked into my office, closed the door, and sat down. Carter Sloan was one of those people who wore their ambition so close to the surface you could see it move under their skin. He had been at Mercer and Voss for 6 years, always the second name mentioned in any conversation about top creative talent, and I had understood from about month 2 that he resented my presence with a specific, focused energy. He sat down, smiled pleasantly, and said, "Henry, I need to talk to you about the Pinnacle submission." I said, "Okay." In reviewing the campaign materials, and I have serious concerns about the originality of the core concept. I think the See Yourself framework bears a significant resemblance to a 2019 UK campaign for the National Health Service. Close enough that if it gets flagged during judging, could be more than embarrassing for Alexander, could be damaging for the whole agency. I felt something cold move through me. I said, "That is not true." He shrugged pleasantly and said, "I am just sharing what I see. I thought you should know before it goes any further. It would be a shame for your first Pinnacle to end with a plagiarism investigation." He stood, buttoned his jacket, and left. I sat very still for about 30 seconds. Then I pulled up the 2019 NHS campaign on my screen and spent an hour going through every piece of it with the focused desperation of someone defusing a bomb. The campaigns were not the same. First framework around physical checkups. See Yourself was entirely narrative-driven, centered on emotional recognition rather than medical action. The thematic territory overlapped in the broad, inevitable way that any two healthcare campaigns would. There was no plagiarism, or imitation. Carter had known that when he sat down in my office. This was not a concern. I went to Alexander that evening, after the floor had mostly cleared. I laid out exactly what Carter had said and exactly why it was false, methodically and without embellishment. I watched Alexander's face as I spoke, that precise and controlled face, and saw something tighten almost imperceptibly in his jaw. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Did he threaten you directly or just imply?" I said, "Just implied." I said, "Alexander, I need you to know the campaigns are not the same. I would not submit something that," he said, "Henry, stop, work. I have known your work for 11 months. I am not entertaining this for even 30 seconds. He said it with such flat certainty that I felt the knot in my chest loosen by about half. Then he said, more quietly, "I am sorry he came to you with that. He should have come to me. He knew you would not take the bait." Alexander looked at me. Expression. Something small and precise and carefully managed. And he said, "He probably did know that." I drove home that night feeling the specific vertigo of understanding something you are not supposed to understand yet. The 2 weeks before the submission deadline were the most intense of my professional life. Alexander and I worked late almost every night, refining, pressure testing, arguing constructively about creative choices in the way we always had, that particular rhythm we had developed where disagreement felt like collaboration rather than conflict. The rest of the team cycled in and out, but we were always the last two there. One night, around 11, we were going through the final narrative sequence for the campaign's anchor piece, a 2-minute video component, and I read aloud a line I had just revised. "You already know something is wrong. You have known for a long time." Out loud. The room was quiet. Softly, "That is the whole campaign in one sentence." I said, "Yeah." He was looking at the script, not at me. Then he said, still not looking up, "Can I ask you something personal?" I said, "Sure. Care. Out of everything, why did you want this account?" I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "My younger brother spent most of his teens dealing with a mental health crisis nobody in our family wanted to name out loud, including me. 19. And I did not know how to look at it directly. I did not have the permission. I think I wrote this campaign because I needed someone to have said that line to me 10 years ago. The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. Fuller. Somehow. He turned his chair to face me properly. He said, "Henry." I said, "Yeah. I'm trying very hard for 11 months to be your creative director and nothing else." My heart did something catastrophic. I said, carefully, "I know." He said, "I need you to know I understand if that is all you want this to be." I said, "Alexander." Said, "It has not been all I wanted this to be since approximately day 4. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he did something I had never seen him do in 11 months of working together. He smiled. Old, professional version. A real one, unguarded and warm, the kind that changed his entire face. He said, "Day 4. I said, "The hotel campaign." You said honest. Quietly, I remember. We sat there in the empty office, the city glowing beneath us, and did not say anything else for a moment that lasted a long time and no time at all. And then, because we were both professionals with a pinnacle submission deadline in 9 days, we picked up the script and kept working. But everything was different, Ben said. We did not need to. Something settled between us that had no name but had a very specific texture. A look held a half-second longer. A hand resting briefly on a shoulder. The particular quality of being known by someone and knowing them back. We submitted the campaign on a Wednesday afternoon. On Thursday morning, I got into the elevator at 7:13 a.m. At 7:14, Alexander stepped in. The doors closed. I looked at him. 17 floors between the lobby and the 22nd floor. 11 months of restraint simply ran out. I do not know which one of us moved first. I am not sure it matters. 7:14 a.m. On a Thursday morning, in the elevator of Mercer and Voss Advertising, Alexander Voss kissed me with the quiet, absolute certainty of someone who had been waiting a very long time to do exactly that. And I kissed him back. Open. The elevator opened on the 22nd floor. There were 7 people standing in the hallway. Not gathered deliberately, the way people gather when they are expecting something. Gathered the way people gather when they are early to work and waiting for the coffee machine and talking about nothing in particular. Clustered in that organic, shapeless way of a weekday morning. They went completely silent. Alexander and I both turned at the same moment. And for one suspended, terrible second, nobody moved. 7 faces, all of them people I had worked beside for 11 months, staring at us with expressions that moved through shock and confusion and something else, something that had not fully resolved into anything yet. I stepped out of the elevator. Alexander stepped out behind me. His expression had shifted back to something controlled and careful, but there was color in his face too, and his composure had a visible seam in it for the first time I had ever seen. Someone said, very quietly, I do not know who said it. By 9 a.m., the story had traveled in the specific way that office stories travel, not as a single told narrative but as 100 whispered fragments. Each one slightly different, each one carrying just enough truth to be dangerous. I knew because the energy of the floor had changed entirely. It had the particular charge of a place where everyone knows something and nobody is saying it directly. People came to my desk for the most trivial, invented reasons, questions that could have been answered by a 10-second internet search, and asked them while not quite meeting my eyes. Priya, the art director who had sat beside me on day 1, was the only one who came to my desk and said what she actually meant. She sat in the empty chair across from me, folded her hands on my desk, and said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I think so." She said, "Henry, it has a direct feed to the building management system and to the agency's internal compliance server. It is standard policy for a firm this size." I looked at her. Footage gets reviewed when there are HR flags or incident reports. And someone, I do not know who, filed an anonymous HR flag this morning at 8:03. My stomach dropped. I said, "Carter," and said nothing, which was its own answer. I said, "How bad is this?" She said, carefully, "I think it depends on how it gets handled in the next few hours. There are policies about relationships between supervisors and direct reports. Alexander is technically your chain of command superior. That creates a conflict of interest issue regardless of anything else." She paused, then added, quietly, "For what it is worth, I have worked here for 4 years. I have never once heard anyone say anything negative about Alexander Voss as a human being. As a boss, sure. Never. I think most people here will land on the right side of this. I said, most people, and to try to make this about professional ethics and favoritism. He is going to argue that the pinnacle submission was compromised by the relationship. He is going to go as high as he can take it. I understood then, with complete clarity, what the last 3 weeks had actually been. The plagiarism accusation had not been an opening move in a campaign against me. It had been reconnaissance. Tested my reaction, and then waited. And when the elevator gave him exactly what he needed, he moved in 15 minutes. I said, he has been watching us. Priya said, I think he has been waiting for something to watch. I was called into the head of HR's office at 10:30 a.m. Her name was Margaret Osei, a composed and precise woman who had been at the agency for 12 years and who approached difficult conversations with the dispassionate thoroughness of a surgeon. She told me that an internal review had been opened, that the nature of the review was a potential violation of the agency's supervisor-direct report relationship policy, that during the review period, it was standard procedure for one party to be temporarily reassigned to a different reporting structure to eliminate the conflict of interest. She said it all without inflection, and then asked if I had any questions. I asked if Alexander had been informed. She said he had. Meeting with HR right now. She said, he will be shortly. I walked back to my desk feeling the particular numbness that settles in after a blow lands too precisely to fully register. At 11:15, Carter Sloan walked past my desk and slowed his pace just enough to make it deliberate. He did not say anything. He did not need to. With a quiet, satisfied expression, the face of someone who has executed a plan correctly and kept walking. I sat very still for a moment. Not anger, exactly, or not only anger. It was something harder and more precise than anger. It was the feeling of understanding exactly what someone has done and deciding that you are not going to let them do it. I opened my email, what I did and did not do in the next 40 minutes, because it matters. I did not do anything reckless. What I did was go back through 11 months of campaign work and pull together a precise, documented record of the creative development of See Yourself. Every draft, every revision note, every email thread where Alexander and I had discussed and debated and pushed back on each other in the normal, professional, appropriate way that we had always operated. I compiled it into a file, 19 NHS campaign, and ran a side-by-side comparison, documented and annotated, showing specifically and in detail why the plagiarism claim was not supportable. Then I wrote a memo. It was scrupulously professional. It addressed the conflict of interest review directly and said that I understood the policy and had no objection to a reassignment of reporting structure during the review. It stated clearly that the relationship between Alexander Voss and myself had not begun until after the pinnacle submission was complete, which was true, because whatever had been said in the conference room 9 days before the submission, nothing had actually happened, not in any formal or physical sense, until the elevator. It stated that any claim of creative favoritism or professional compromise in the pinnacle submission was factually insupportable and offered the 11 months of documentation as evidence. And it stated, in one carefully worded paragraph, that an anonymous HR complaint filed 17 minutes after a private incident became visible to colleagues' warranted consideration of whether the complaint was motivated by professional concern or by professional rivalry, and that the timing and the prior incident of a false plagiarism accusation 3 weeks earlier were relevant context. I sent it to Margaret Osei. Then I sat back in my chair, looked at the city through the window, and waited. Edmund Voss called Margaret Osei's office at 2:17 p.m. I know the exact time because Priya, who had been quietly monitoring the situation with the focused attention of an air traffic controller, texted me 2 words at 2:18. Edmund called. I sat at my desk and did not move. At 2:45, Margaret Osei appeared at my desk and asked me to come back to her office. She looked different than she had at 10:30. Not unsettled, exactly, but altered in some small, significant way, the way someone looks when a situation has turned in a direction they had not fully anticipated. She closed the door. Henry, I want to walk you through where things stand. The review is still formally open, as it must be until the process is completed. However, the documentation you submitted this afternoon has been received and is being evaluated as part of that review. She paused, then said, Edmund Voss has also chosen to make a formal statement to the review committee, which he is within his rights to do as a founding partner. I said, what did he say? She said, carefully, Edmund stated that he has reviewed the campaign development materials, that he has no concern about the integrity of the Pinnacle submission, and that he considers the timeline of the personal matter between you and Alexander to be a private one, provided standard reassignment protocols are followed during the review period. She let that sit for a moment. Sloan, she said, the committee will also be reviewing the circumstances of the original complaint, including the prior plagiarism allegation and its timeline. That process is separate and I cannot speak to its outcome, but I want you to know it is being taken seriously. I walked out of her office and stood in the hallway for a moment, breathing. Alexander found me at 4:30. He came to my desk with the direct, deliberate walk of someone who has made a decision, the particular stride I recognized from 100 conference rooms. He said, quietly, can we talk? Not here. We took the stairs to the roof access, the one place in the building where there were no cameras and no colleagues, just the wide Manhattan sky and the noise of the city 40 floors below. He stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at me for a moment. Then he said, I read your memo. I said, okay. You documented 11 months of our work together to protect the campaign and submitted it to HR and to my father within 40 minutes of the review opening. I said, yes. I do not know. Waited to see what happened. How I operate. He was quiet for a moment. He looked, in that moment, less like the formidable creative director I had spent 11 months slightly afraid of and more like a person, just a person, standing on a rooftop trying to find the right words. He said, when I walked out of Margaret's office, my father called me on my cell phone. He said he had read your memo, and then he said, that is the kind of person you want in your corner. I said, what did you say? Alexander said, I told him I already knew that. The city moved below us, enormous and indifferent and full of its own endless motion, and we stood there on that rooftop and I felt the full weight of the day settle over me at last. The elevator, hallway, Carter's satisfied expression, Margaret's measured words, filtered through his son's retelling, saying that kind of person. I said, Alexander, the review runs its course, which it will. I get reassigned out of your direct reporting chain, which is fair and I already agreed to it. Priya will serve as your interim supervisor of record during the process. He paused, then said, and Carter Sloan is going to find the next few weeks fairly uncomfortable. My father is not a sentimental man, but he is a precise one. He does not like when someone tries to use his agency as a weapon. I said, and us? Alexander looked at me, and that same thing moved across his face that I had first seen in a conference room at 11 months and 3 days ago. That unguarded, careful thing. He said, I meant what I said in the conference room 3 weeks ago about trying to be only your creative director. I said, I know. I mean this. Right now. If you want to navigate whatever this review becomes, and whatever comes after, I would like to do that with you, properly. Elevators. I looked at him for a long moment. But the elevator was technically your fault. He said, that is a matter of disputed record. I said, there is a camera, Alexander. He said, the camera shows two people standing in an elevator. What either one of them was thinking is not on record. I said, quietly, I was thinking that I had been waiting 11 months. He said, quietly, so was I. The Pinnacle Award submission results were announced 6 weeks later. See Yourself won the Grand Prix. Conference room when the call came in, surrounded by the entire creative team, and the sound that went up was the kind that fills a room and then keeps going, spilling out into the hallway and down the corridor. Alexander was standing across the room. In the chaos of the moment, people moving and calling out and someone popping a bottle of something, he caught my eye across the crowd. He did not say anything. Carter Sloan resigned 4 weeks before the Pinnacle announcement, which everyone knew but nobody said out loud was not entirely voluntary. The HR review closed with a formal notation that the complaint had been filed without substantive evidentiary basis, and that the prior plagiarism allegation had been similarly unsubstantiated. Both notations went into the permanent file. Carter left for a smaller agency in Chicago and sent a group email to the floor that nobody responded to with any particular warmth. I was formally reassigned to report to Priya during the review, and once the review closed, a new organizational structure was proposed, one in which I had a dotted line reporting relationship to Alexander as creative director but a direct operational chain through the creative management team. It was a structure that made clean sense professionally and that also, not coincidentally, removed any policy ambiguity about what Alexander and I were to each other outside the office. Edmund Voss signed off on the restructuring in a meeting I was not in but heard about through Priya, who heard about it through Margaret Osei, who apparently described Edmund's manner as characteristically brief. He had looked at the org chart, said, "This is reasonable," and signed it. On a Saturday morning in May, Alexander and I walked along the High Line in the early quiet before the crowds arrived. The city was soft with spring light, the kind of morning that makes New York feel like it was designed specifically for this hour. He said, "My father asked me about you at dinner last week." I said, "What did he ask?" He said, "He asked if I was sure about what I was doing." I said, "What did you say?" Alexander looked at me. The light was good, and the morning was easy, and he had his coffee in one hand and the particular expression of someone who has stopped trying to manage what his face does. He said, "I told him I have never been more sure of anything in my professional life." I said, "That is not quite what he asked." He said, "No." Answer I had. I looked at him, this precise, demanding, extraordinary person who had understood my work on day 4 and never once given me easy. I said, "Day 4. He said, "I felt it on day 4. I was a disaster about it for 11 months. I said, "You hit it remarkably well." He said, "I am a professional." I said, "The elevator suggests otherwise." He looked at me with that real smile, the unguarded one that still changed his entire face, and said, "In my defense, you were standing very close." The High Line stretched ahead of us in the morning light, the city rising on all sides, enormous and indifferent and full of the particular grace of ordinary days that turn out to matter. I said, "Alexander," said, "Give me honest. Every time." Moment. And then he said, "Every time." Without question. Standing in the May light, two people on the other side of a thing that had cracked everything open and left it better than before. That was enough. Enough.